Hello, and I hope everyone's having a good Thursday morning. At this time, it is a little after the full hour, so we will just make a start with our week 14 live online session. And let me just start by sharing a screen so we can visit what's going on this week. And if we scroll within the learning modules this week, which is way at the bottom, isn't it exciting that we're approaching so close to the end of the semester? We will see that this week we have been focusing on male reproductive system as per our calendar. However, I do want to share that we kind of tried to work a little bit ahead and covered during the class time both male and female reproductive systems. And the intent of this was that we get the lecture material covered, as next week is bound to be busy with multiple things going on, end of the semester approaching, and a very hands-on, very involved lab that we'll be completing as well. So this week in this live online session, my intention is to cover both male and female reproductive systems at the very general level. For the full materials, you have your lecture videos available both for this week and for the next week, going through in a little bit more detail the content as it relates to this system. I've also offered a few other resources there. I guess that from the side of the students, what students are always curious is that what is the homework I'm expected to do this week. So as always, we do have a quiz for you to complete. And remember that these quizzes are very much of a learning opportunity. So as you work through those questions, you have a link to the textbook, and by using that quiz to guide you that study of the or a review of the textbook, you will make sure that you're covering all of the needed material. In addition, as we will be covering both male and female reproductive system only on a fairly general level, you will be able to get more detailed structures and more detailed information by completing the anatomy practice homework. And remember that these anatomy practice homeworks are where the questions for your practical are pulled from. So definitely a worthwhile thing to complete as well. Final thing that we complete this week for homework is the testosterone levels in athletes lab activity. And this is a really good lab activity that kind of gives you a chance to do things that we would expect you to do, especially at the university level. So you will be presented with data, and then we will try to deduct some kind of a general level understanding of the world where we live in from that data. So a very, very, very worthwhile activity to complete as well. And of course, all of these carried points towards your final grade. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to jump in to another presentation, and we're going to start with the male reproductive system and just simply go through some of the general topics that relate to this system. Before we really dive into much further, I do, however, want to revise and revisit few important key concepts when it comes to the reproductive systems. So reproductive systems are going to be the only system that we have studied so far, and we will study, that you can live without. You can perfectly fine survive without reproductive system, of course, then you're just not going to have offspring. From an evolutionary point of view, we've kind of explored that in our classes a little bit. The big goal for our existence is to produce a viable offspring that's able to produce their own offspring. So really passing that genetic material onwards. That's our big goal from the perspective of evolutionary biology. When we're talking about reproductive systems, it's important that we are comfortable with few key terms. And let's start with the term gonad. So gonads are our primary sex organs. So in case of the males, the male gonad is of course going to be our testis, and for the females, we're going to be looking at ovaries, obviously. All other structures that we will cover on this review session of the male and female reproductive system are going to be our accessory reproductive organs. So one thing that you'll notice is that we're going to have various different glands, and we're going to have a lot of kind of duct network, these tubes that connect different parts to each other. And then we're going to see a few other structures as well. But really all of these other glands, all of these other ducts are going to be our accessory structures, where the primary sex organs that we'll be focusing are testes and ovaries. If we think of the function of the gonads, we will see that we are ending up with two-folded function. The first function is obviously to produce the sex cells. So in case of males, the spermatozoa, and in case of females, the oocyte or ova, as it's sometimes referred. But producing the sex cell is not the only function of our gonads. In addition, gonads produce important sex hormones, and we'll be having a look of those sex hormones and effects of those sex hormones as well in today's short visit of these systems. So what I was hoping to do next is to review the male reproductive system, and we'll review that by going through it structure by structure, and we'll actually draw it out very diagrammatically ourselves, and hopefully we'll end up with a drawing that resembles something like what you will be seeing here. The important thing to take away from the review of the male reproductive system, I guess, is the fact that we're going to be noticing that it's much more straightforward, much more simpler than what we will be seeing when we talk about the female reproductive system. Us guys, we're not really that complex, so it should be a fairly nice and easy run through of the structures. So let's do that. Let's draw this system together. And we're going to start with the male gonad, the primary sex organ of the male. And this is, of course, going to be, these are going to be our testes. So testes had a two-folded function, really, if you think about it. First of all, to produce the sex cell, which was, of course, going to be our sperm. But also to produce the sex hormones. And let's have a look of this a little bit in more detail in terms of positioning this structure on this diagram that we'll put together here. So this structure that we're going to be looking at here is going to be the testis. Obviously, there's going to be two testes, one on each side. And like we saw, the important role was to produce the produce our sperm and produce our male sex hormones. So even though sperm is produced within the testes, the end product that we will be left with is not going to be yet ready, fully functional sperm. It's not going to be fully mature. So instead, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's just change that a little bit. This looks better. Instead, what we will find is that on top of the testis, there's this structure of a coiled up tube resting on the surface of the testis. This is going to be our epididymis. And this is where the sperm goes to be maturing and also to be stored for when it is needed at a later time. So that's the important role of this. As one of my students back in the day told me their aha moment, which I think is a kind of a cute way to think about it, is that even sperm has to go to school. Even sperm needs to mature before it is ready to be then sent out to do its job. So this is the tightly coiled tube, like I mentioned, resting on the surface of the testis. So let's continue our review of different structures. And often, as we've seen before, when a structure is really important, we end up seeing a few different names that can be used for it. So the next structure is called vas deferens or ductus deferens, depending a little bit of which textbook you're using, whether we're talking of more British expressions or whether we're talking more Americanized textbooks. But vas deferens and ductus deferens, you can consider them as being used fairly interchangeably. This, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's just fix that real quick. That looks better. This tube is a muscular tube that carries the sperm from the epididymis further, and it's about 45 centimeters in length if you want to think of the length of it. When someone gets vasectomy, it is this tube that we then cut and tie. One thing that adds up to the length of the vas deferens that kind of might help to explain that why is it so long, why is the journey so long, is that we want to remember that it wraps around and over the urinary bladder, which we can see here that I've sketched it in here. So kind of this journey to go over and to the posterior side of the urinary bladder is what adds length to this structure. So the next structure that I wanted to add to our review can be really considered as an expansion of the vas deferens. So towards the very end, at the posterior side of the urinary bladder, the vas deferens or ductus deferens kind of grows a little bit wider. This structure is going to be known as ampulla. So it's kind of this widening of the ductus deferens, vas deferens. For some reason, my screen is super sensitive and did that error there. So let's just fix it by drawing it a little bit better again. We don't want those lines everywhere on the screen. Well, let's continue our tube structures and then add to the remaining structures, the glands that we're going to be seeing. So we're going to have the ampulla continuing the journey. And in addition, we're going to have one gland that we're going to have a look of emptying its secretions at this point to this system. But what's going to be important is going to be that after that, the rest of the tract is actually shared by the reproductive and urinary system. So that's going to be, of course, our urethra that we're really familiar with. So let's just label these. So first of all, when we have the duct structure that's only dedicated to the reproductive system following the ampulla, that's going to be known as our ejaculatory duct. So only the secretions that get added to the sperm leaving the testis travel within this part. Once the secretions and the sperm have to share this duct system with the urinary system, we start talking about the urethra. So urethra is the part of the duct system that's shared by these two, both of these two systems. And one of the things that we'll end up noticing is that to keep this clear, if you wish, men do often get a need of urinate after intercourse. So that would be one of the things that we see taking place there. What I wanted to do next was to add to this diagram of ours the rest of the glands that are going to be important. And let's start with seminal vesicle. So seminal vesicle is located kind of next to the ampulla, and it releases secretions that are really the first set of secretions that we see being added into this mixture of things that will then produce the semen. And secretions from seminal vesicle are very alkaline, very fructose rich, and contains various prostaglandins, which are these hormone-like lipids. If we think of these secretions, the rich fructose content of the seminal vesicle contributes as kind of an energy boost to the sperm. If you think about it and you look at this diagram, by this stage, the sperm has traveled about half of the journey. So it's used a lot of the energy that it has within the sperm cell itself. So adding this fructose-rich secretions is definitely going to help by giving that boost so that it can keep doing the sperm, the locomotion, keep doing that swimming action. In addition, this alkalinity of the secretions from seminal vesicles helps with ensuring that when the semen is released, it's not going to be impacted by the pH conditions of the female reproductive tract, but has a chance to succeed and do its job. So let's add that. The next gland that I want to talk about that's going to be really important gland is going to be located here at the base of the urinary bladder. And you'll notice that also the structures that go to the or are part of the reproductive system have to go through the duct system that's inside this gland. And this gland is, of course, gonna be our prostate gland. And what we want to notice with the prostate gland is a few different things. Let's just highlight it on our diagram to make it more visible. So first of all, prostate gland contributes to these secretions that result as semen, as the result of the male reproductive tract carrying the sperm and carrying the secretions that we're seeing. So prostate contributes to those. In addition, this thin, milky alkaline fluid, we want to notice that both the urinary system and the reproductive system have ducts that run through the prostate gland. And this could become an issue if there's excessive growth of the prostate, which is the reality for many of us men when we get older, that the likelihood of having excessive growth of the prostate increases. And if this is the case, of course, we want to make sure that it's a localized growth, it's not spreading elsewhere, but just as well, we might end up with challenges if this prostate growth ends up squeezing these ducts closed. And that would be a problem. Prostate cancer can cause issues with emptying the urinary bladder and also sexual functions. So that's something to keep on mind. And to treat that really depends on the type of cancer, type of growth that we have, how aggressive it is it localized, is it spreading? But we definitely want to relieve these ducts so that materials can pass through as they should. The final gland that I want to add to our diagram is going to be located here. And let's just label that as well. And this is going to be called our bulbourethral gland, or sometimes also as Copworth's gland. So again, two possible names that can be sometimes used, so don't let that throw you off. So bulbourethral gland or Copworth's gland releases the secretions in response to sexual stimulation. And this secretion is really mucus-like fluid. Like I said, released in response to sexual stimulation, this kind of a gland located inferior to the prostate gland. At this point, we've covered all of the glands and we've covered all of the duct system, but there's still a couple of important structures that I want to highlight, that we just make sure that we know that they exist and why they exist and what their role is. And this is going to be the erectile tissue that surrounds our urethra, the most external parts of the male sex organs. So let's add those to our diagram. And these are going to be our corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. Let me just see if I can pick a color that we haven't used yet, so that we don't get the diagram more confused. I think it's always a good idea to try to keep it as simple as possible. We want to highlight structures, but we don't want to create more confusion. So corpus cavernosum and spongiosum are tissues that when they receive blood building up to those, they swell and help in this way to contribute for erection to happen. They're the erectile tissues. And really the function is to enable us to have this insertion of the penis into vagina. So those are the structures that I had on mind that I wanted to revise as part of the male reproductive system. And we can label that as well to the very top. Let's just do So that's our male reproductive system that covers a lot of what I had on mind that's important for us to discuss, and that's going to be some of the key structures for us to know when it comes to the male reproductive system. And of course, like I said before, you can fill in some of the gaps as we revise the practice anatomy of this chapter as well. Here you'll see a little bit more finessed diagrams showing very much the same structures that we already discussed. So if you find that easier for following along, that is available for you there. But what I wanted to talk next was about the structure known as scrotum. So scrotum is this muscular sac that holds the testicles. There's going to be also a lot of blood vessels and the spermatid cord, so vas deferens or ductus deferens partially, and so on. Scrotum holds the testis just slightly outside the male body, forming the external part of the external male genitalia, just behind and underneath the penis. The goal of this, or the reason for this, is that sperm to develop optimally needs a little bit cooler temperature than what our body temperature is. So by having the scrotum, having the testis slightly outside the body, we're able to provide that. Scrotum is divided into two compartments, one side for each testis. And of course, in response to the temperature changes, the goal for us is to keep the temperature constant. So if it is too cold outside, then dartos muscle and cremaster muscle play a role in pulling the dartos, pulling the scrotum closer to the body, and cremaster elevating the testis. So again, that we maintain that optimal temperature for the sperm to be produced and mature. Other thing that I've just added here kind of as a disclaimer, because we will be talking on our lab this week about sex differences. Remember, when we're talking about sex in this class, we're talking about a biological construct. Something that's what you're born with, that's coded into your DNA, whereas gender and gender identity is much more of a sociocultural creation or a term, so there's much more fluidity in that. And by bringing this forward at this point, I just want to insert, that I am not intentionally trying to upset anyone or offend anyone. We're simply approaching this purely from a scientific standpoint when we're talking about the sex differences. I completely realize and fully support, and I'm an advocate for acknowledging that there's much more to this story when we talk about gender differences. What I wanted to share here with this slide is really that the production of the sperm, that process is known as spermatogenesis. And this takes place at the testis, like we saw before. In fact, if we want to be very precise, at the seminiferous tubules of the testis. So you can have a look of a little bit more detail of the different parts of the testis on your practice anatomy. We remember that the big goal here was to reduce the chromosome number into half for the production of the sex cells, both for the sperm and egg cell. And I assume that you've covered the processes of mitosis and then the process of meiosis before. I have also provided all that as a review sheet if anyone's kind of confused or has questions about that and you want to kind of tackle that, that has been made available for you as well. Couple of parts of the sperm or spermatozoa that I wanted to highlight. Let's have a look of those. So let's start with the head of the sperm cell. So head part of the spermatozoa contain the genetic material within the nucleus. So this is what we're trying to get to the egg cell so that the fertilization can happen, so that the father's contribution to the genetic material is added. But in addition, head importantly contains this kind of a helmet-like acrosome that holds various different kinds of enzymes that help us to penetrate through those layers surrounding the egg cell so that the sperm is actually able to fuse and release the genetic material into the egg cell. So those enzymes are housed there within the head of the sperm cell. The midpiece of the sperm cell plays an important role in terms of housing a lot of mitochondria that help to produce ATP. And this rich ATP supply is very, very important so that the tail can do locomotion, so help the sperm cell to swim along. So that's an important thing for us. You remember when we talked about our seminal vesicle releasing secretions that were kind of rich in fructose. That fructose was there to serve so that the mitochondria could keep producing more ATP so that the sperm could keep on swimming. Sperm lives outside the male body within the female reproductive tract for about 3 days. And these timelines are going to be important when we talk about the delay between the moment when fertilization happens and when the fertilized egg cell then implants into the female uterus. So there needs to be a little bit of delay on that. So for the sperm to do its journey and find the egg cell and be able to do fertilization, this 3 days is about the timeline that we give for that, living within the, or surviving within the female reproductive tract. For the hormonal control, hormonal regulation of male reproductive system, I have a whole nice video about that available for you if you're interested in the lecture materials. So I'll just refer you to that for a full story if you wish. So I hope that you will find that useful and helpful. And I think that that's where we're gonna leave that. I do want to mention, though, that we see these cascades, a kind of how endocrine system work, that one thing triggered another. The hypothalamus released the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then acted on the anterior pituitary that released follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Also, testes play an important role in releasing especially testosterone. That's going to be our interest. All of this is regulated through the negative feedback mechanism of the homeostatic mechanism. So inhibin becomes important in that. And like I said, I go into much greater detail of this in the full lecture video. One thing that I wanted to highlight at this point was the changes in testosterone levels throughout male's lifetime. So what we'll notice is that during the early development, there is quite high levels of testosterone, but these levels then kind of drop and remain low after birth. So during the postnatal life until we reach the age of puberty, when the testosterone levels peak again. And testosterone levels remain high for much of the life. It is not unheard for older men to father a child. There is some drop in the quality at the very end of the life. So the sperm quality is not quite as high. But like we talked earlier on, when you reach the puberty and become sexually mature or able to produce offspring, that's when we start to see the sperm production starting to take place. So that about completes all that I had on mind to say about the male reproductive tract. Do remember that semen or seminal fluid is this fluid that gets released during the process of ejaculation, is a mixture of sperm, glandular secretions, nutrients, and prostaglandins with the goal of nourishing, helping with the transport, neutralizing the pH, lubricating, preventing infection. So there's a lot going on there that we can keep on mind. So I think that this is a great place for us to wrap up the male reproductive system. But that by no means is not all that I had planned to do today. So like I shared earlier on, it is my hope that we are going to be able to also discuss about the female reproductive system. I think that that becomes very important for us as well. Just let me jump around here and get the next set of slides that I want to share available. I wanted to talk briefly about the female reproductive system next. So let's have a look of that. And let's start by comparing and contrasting. Whereas in the males, the hormone levels remain fairly consistent throughout the adulthood after the puberty, becoming sexually mature. There is a cyclical nature to the female hormone changes and the effects that the hormones have. That we see on the female. So this is much more complex. If we think about the role of the female reproductive system, we have a little bit more to do, not just to produce the egg cell, the ova, and not just to produce the sex hormones, but also to prepare for sustaining that fertilized egg cell if a fertilization happens. So this goal makes it a little bit more complex, and we end up seeing a menstrual cycle that's about 30 days. I think the average is 28 days. That plays an important role. So again, the female gonad is gonna be gonads are gonna be our ovaries with the goal of producing the ova and sex hormones. We'll have a look of the role of estrogen and progesterone in a little bit more detail, but the important thing is that these play a role in helping us to prepare to sustain that pregnancy. We're gonna be focusing on the internal structures, and I'll leave the external genitalia for you to revise when you work through the practice anatomy component. So again, I have a very nice diagram here, and we'll do our own version as we revise the different parts of the female reproductive system. So let's do just that together. Let me just get a colored pens there. So we're gonna start with the female gonad, which is gonna be our ovary. So the role of the ovary is to produce the egg cell and also to produce the female sex hormones. So let's add the ovary here to our diagram. One interesting thing about the ovary is that, of course, there's going to be multiple egg cells that start to mature during the early phases of the monthly cycle, but only one of those comes to the full maturation. Other thing that we see with the ovary is that the egg cell is shed outside the ovary to this pelvic cavity. So it needs to be salvaged. So there's not a direct anatomical direct connection between the ovary and rest of the reproductive tract. So for that reason, the next structure, which is our fimbriae, becomes very important. You can consider it like this as finger-like projections that sweep within this pelvic cavity to catch that egg cell that was shed outside the reproductive tract and kind of bring it back online, bring it back to the reproductive tract. So let's just add that to our diagram here. And following the fimbriae, what's interesting is that we're going to have this kind of a funnel-like structure, if you wish to describe it as such, that helps to direct the egg cell again to the uterine tube. So let's add that to our structures that we want to know. So our infundibulum here. Next parts that I want to discuss as it relates to the tract are going to be the parts of the uterine tube or fallopian tube. So let's put it here. And uterine tube or the fallopian tube has actually a few different distinct parts that I do want us to focus a little bit on so we can see the difference and importance of what both contribute. So let's do just that. And I think we're going to start with the ampulla. Just going to label that for us. So ampulla is this first part that we'll have a look of. It's thinner, longer part. This is normally the site where fertilization takes place. So the sperm travels all the way up here, and this is where the fertilization takes place. And then the fertilized egg cell has about 2 to 3 days to travel to the uterus to implant there. So during this 2 to 3 days, the fertilized egg cell starts to divide, and by the time it reaches the uterus, it's now ready and capable of being sustained as it implants to the uterine wall lining. The later part, which is a shorter part, is going to be our isthmus, about a couple of centimeters long, thicker part of the uterine fallopian tube. So that's something to keep on mind to see there. And finally, I think we should talk about the uterus. So let's have a look of the different parts of the uterus. The first part of the uterus that we're going to look at is going to be the roof of the uterus, if you wish to call it that. So the very top part, and that's going to be called our fundus. And we've seen the term fundus being used before in our classes. So you remember that fundus referred to this kind of most superior portion of an organ. We saw fundus, for example, with the stomach, and we saw fundus with the gallbladder. Fundus is often also the part that's furthest away from the opening of an organ. The next part is gonna be our body. And body of the uterus forms about 2/3 of the uterus. Again, an important structure for us to be aware of. And it is within the fundus or the body of the uterus where we hope that this fertilized egg cell implants to. So that's why we do those early ultrasounds to define where the implantation has happened, because this is going to be some very, very important information for us as we plan on how to progress through this pregnancy. And of course, the final part of the uterus is going to be our cervix. So cervix is like the final, I think that the most inferior 1/3, if you wish to kind of classify it in terms of the size of the structure that's being taken. Cervix is not an ideal place for the egg cell to implant. We prefer that the egg cell that's fertilized would implant either to the fundus or body, because if there's an implantation to the cervix, we might have an issue if the placenta develops through the opening of the cervix. That would be an issue during the delivery, and probably a natural birth would not be an option. We would have to consider C-section. So we just want to be aware of what we're dealing with as early as possible. And the final structure that I'm going to add into here is going to be our vagina. We're of course going to have vulva and perineum, the more external genitalia, but like I said, I'll leave that for you to study more independently. But what you'll notice is that cervix partially extends to the vagina. So that's a worthwhile thing to notice as you are wondering how we can get these cervical smears, cervical cell samples. Well, that would be the explanation to there. Vagina really receives the penis as during the intercourse, and of course the baby has to come out through there as well. So this was our female reproductive system diagram. And I think that it quite nicely summarizes some of the key structures for us to know. Again, I have a little bit more finessed diagram showing the similar structures in case you're wondering about those. And 3 ligaments that I wanted to highlight that hold everything in place: ovarian ligament connecting from the ovary to the uterine wall, uterus more medially, our suspensory ligament anchoring the ovary laterally to the pelvic wall, and finally broad ligament, which kind of holds all of this sheet-like structure nicely on place. A couple of other things when we talk about the female reproductive cycle, the monthly cycle, we get back to seeing multiple systems working together. So this is why I really enjoy this concept for us. So you remember the gonadotropins that are being released from the anterior pituitary under the control of hypothalamus are going to be our follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone driving the development of follicles. So follicle is the developing egg cell and the tissue material around it. And there were multiple follicles developing initially, but only one of them matures fully per each cycle. About 24 hours before, there's going to be a surge in luteinizing hormone, and then ovulation happens. So the egg cell is shed outside from the ovary as the follicle fuses with the wall of the ovary. There can be distinctive pain either on right or left side depending on which ovary is in that cycle releasing that egg cell. The remaining parts of the follicle now become corpus luteum that start to secrete 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. What estrogen does, estrogen drives the thickening of the uterine wall lining, the endometrium of the uterus. So the uterus starts to prepare for the egg cell in case it gets fertilized so that it can receive the fertilized egg cell and sustain it. Progesterone instead contributes to making this uterine wall lining much more vascular and much more glandular, so that we are getting that vascularity so that that fertilized egg cell that's now dividing can implant to the wall, can get the nutrients from there. And these glandular secretions are really important nutrients for the early development of this fertilized egg cell. Well, if a pregnancy takes place, the corpus luteum gets salvaged, so it just remains there and keeps secreting estrogen and progesterone, maintaining the uterine wall lining that then is this way able to support the fertilized egg cell and the pregnancy. And this keeps going on for several months until the role of producing estrogen and progesterone is then moved on to the placenta. If fertilization does not happen, the corpus luteum will simply keep degenerating. The production of estrogen and progesterone diminishes, and as a result, we end up shedding the uterine wall lining and the menstrual bleeding takes place. So a really nice summary of all the things that happen with the hormonal control of the female menstrual cycle. A couple of terms that I wanted to introduce. Menses refer to the menstrual bleeding, and it's the menarche, the first menstrual cycle that we see. And menopause was when there's been a clinical criteria, when there's been a full year of no menstrual bleeding. We end up seeing that the menarche happens earlier than ever before historically nowadays. And one of the explanations why this might be the case is that human species is better off in terms of having rich nutrition and enough nutrition than ever before. So that might explain that. During the menopause, of course, we have secondary sexual characteristics that tend to disappear because of the changes in the sex hormone levels. This is though really well managed these days with hormone replacement therapy. I wanted to say a couple of words about the mammary glands. So these were modified sweat glands. And even though mammary glands are present in both males and females, and both can get, students sometimes ask me, both can get breast cancer, they're functional only in the female. And breast milk has so many benefits. This is not to put shade or worry for anyone who's not able to breastfeed their child, but if possible, breastfeeding is encouraged. I think that about completes our review of the female reproductive system as well. And again, I have a really nice summary of some of the things that we had a look of on your handouts. If you were not in the class, you'll get a chance to do so, to grab that later on. And on that note, let me just jump out from here. And the final thing that we have to look for is gonna be our review of the lab for this week. And for the interest of being fair when it comes to the lab, let me just open up right view that I want to share. Let's see. This comes up now better. Now we're getting where I want to get. So in the interest of being fair for those students who attended to the class and completed the testosterone levels in athletes lab, I'm just going to introduce it to you, but if you did not have a chance to attend to this lab, it's going to be independent work for you to complete. You will find the worksheet that will guide you to work through it on the assignment. You'll also find the grading criteria, the grading rubric. So that's always useful when you're working through an assignment. So let's share the last element that I wanted to show. So again, a quick reminder when we're talking about this lab where we're looking at the testosterone levels in different athletes, I want to remind that we are talking about biological concept, not sociocultural construct of gender. So in our case now, we're simply thinking of sex as a male or female. Rarely we have cases where sex cannot be determined in a biological sense. That happens, but that's not going to be a major concern for us. I do ask you, however, be respectful and considerate. We do have students who have more complex gender identity. We don't want to hurt anyone or be hurtful on purpose. And we try to be very mindful that these are sensitive topics. So to say a few words about testosterone, testosterone is a naturally produced hormone that triggers the development of the secondary sexual characteristics. And it is also shown that testosterone has direct effect on the amount of muscle mass increase that one has. So with higher testosterone levels, the muscle mass tends to go up. Same happens for the strength. Both males and females do have testosterone present in their body. However, the amount differs. So males typically have much more testosterone than females. It's also worthwhile to notice that there's a range of amount of testosterone. So that varies between the males, but also within the females. So not all male have as much testosterone as other males, or not all female have as much testosterone as other females. So this brings us to consider, could it be that high testosterone levels would be advantage in sports? And I think that there's a lot to unpack in that question, and I'll let you think about that on your own. I do want to show that there's been several cases where we have had to consider this. And back in 2014, the International Association of Athletics Federation and Olympic Committee made a decision that for an athlete to take part on the female sports level, their testosterone levels needed to be below 10 nanomoles per liter. Otherwise, that could be considered as an unfair advantage. marriage. Well, this decision immediately was followed with some backlash and further research that came out, and we will be looking at one of these studies and having a look at what we're finding from this study, where the International Association of Athletics Federation and Olympic Committee right to make their call. So in this study, they looked at about almost 700 elite athletes, so athletes who were competing on the Olympic level, and measured their testosterone levels in the blood and compared individuals' testosterone level against their sex and the specific sport that they competed in. And here are the results. Whenever you're reading results, make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So I've done some editing of the scales of the diagrams just to make them more comparable. So they're side by side, men and women's values. And I've also added that cutoff line that they decided that was 10 nanomoles per liter here to the screen. So we can see each athlete's individual values as a blue dot for both men and women. And there's a lot to unpack here that we're going to be able to see. We're seeing that a lot of the men are above that 10 nanomoles per liter, but we're also noticing that within men, there's a broad range of values. Pretty much all sports have this broad range in case of men. In case of females, men, women, even though a lot of them are below this 10 nanomoles per liter, there are individuals with higher testosterone levels. And there are specific sports where this seems to be more of the case. So there's something to unpack there. And finally, I want to point out from this diagram that do notice that some men are below the 10 nanomoles per liter in their testosterone levels. So that can be also a thing to consider. So your worksheet proposes you a series of questions that I ask you to work through, analyze the data. And finally, there's also 3 opinion questions that I want you to have a look. When it comes to the opinion questions, what's important for me is that you absolutely should have your own opinion, but you should be respectful how you're presenting. For the other questions, make sure that as you are answering, you're basing your answer on the data. It should be data-driven answers that I'm looking for full marks on this activity. And I think that about completes everything that I had planned for us today on this review session. I appreciate you joining me. Make sure you check the announcements on the online for this course. There's been some changes done around. So I just want to make sure that you get all of that information. And on that note, thank you for joining me again, and I hope you have a very good rest of the week.